to welcome all of you to the library, and I will apologize for the fact that it's hotter than Hades in here. But we have had no moving here for 2 days. It finally just got turned on. So if you get casual, I'll understand why. Research in Progress is the title, the overarching title that we've given to a whole series of programs that we sponsor in cooperation with faculty from around the university. Because it's an opportunity for faculty members to talk to each other and to students and to other colleagues about the research that they are engaged in at this time, to get feedback, to get questions, to provoke discussion. And I believe that the library, as the high neutral ground on this campus, is the exact place for these kind of intellectual arguments to take place. So I'm delighted to have you here today. Hope that you don't melt. And turn this over to Sakina to do the introductions and introduce the program.
Great, thank you.
Thanks,
Welcome
Nancy.
everyone. It's so great to see such a wonderful turnout for the last of the eCollaborative Colloquia for the academic year. The eCollaborative Colloquium is a group of faculty across campus who are all working on environmental issues from various different perspectives and disciplines. So this has been our inaugural year, and we've had a series of panels that have featured faculty working on issues surrounding energy, water, and conservation, and climate. Our final panel will be more conversational in nature. So what we've asked the panelists to do is to consider what sustainability means to them from their perspective, through their disciplinary lens. So just briefly to introduce the panelists, David Bartlett from Kogod School of Business. I'm going to come back to you, Larry. Kiho Kim from the Environmental Sciences Department, and Paul Wapner from SIS. And Larry Engel, who is from the School of Communications, has generously agreed to moderate our discussion today. So I'll turn it over to Larry. Oh, and I should mention that Kara Okopny has got the flu, and so she canceled at the last minute, so she sends her apologies. So I'll send.
Well, welcome. It's great to see such a good crowd, and I hope that we can have a lively discussion. And what I'd like to do is to just go along the panel and ask that we each introduce ourselves and give a very brief description of our discipline or field of interest, and then we'll open the floor to the discussion with questions. David?
Okay, David Bartlett, Kogod School, where I wear a couple of hats. I'm executive in residence in the Department of Management, teaching undergraduate courses in global sustainability, as it were, as well as global corporate citizenship, which has several of my students from that class are present in the audience today. I also am the director of global and strategic projects for the full-time MBA program, as well as the director of the full-time MBA program.
Very good. Keo?
My name is Kiho Kim. I'm the chair of the Department of Environmental Science here. I also direct the AU Scholars Program, which is a 2-year program for incoming first-year students.
I'm Paul Wapner. I teach in the School of International Service. I'm in the Global Environmental Politics program. I'm teaching 2 courses right now. Excuse me. I'm teaching a course, 2 freshman seminars. One is called What is Suffering? And the other is called Environmental Ethics.
Very good. And I'm Larry Engel. I am in the Film and Media Arts Division of SOC. I am also the chair of the Faculty Senate this year. I have 3 more meetings, and then I will be finished. And I'm really looking forward to June 15th when that transition happens. But it's been an honor, actually, to serve the larger community, faculty, staff, and students. I'm a documentary filmmaker by profession, and much of my career has been spent in the environmental and wildlife fields. Clearly, and I'm also an associate director of the Center for Environmental Filmmaking that Chris Palmer leads. Without having other researchers, experts, and scientists with whom I can interact and work, I actually would not have a career. So part of my role, I think, here is to recognize that in this kind of interaction, we need to have an interdisciplinary approach where we understand our fields better and look and understand how we look through our lenses on the world of sustainability and environmentalism. So with that, how do you see the world of sustainability? Keo, and then Paul, and then David.
So I think my role is to provide the perspective of a natural scientist. And so I'm a trained ecologist. Specifically, I'm a marine biologist, and so spend a lot of time in the ocean. And looking at the changing, the marinescape with changes in the impact of humanity on the surface of our planet and below the planet. I'm going to start by sort of describing the transformation of the word sustainability from what we used to think of it as sort of a granola-y concept about our place in the world to one that is probably much better undergirded by scientific research and trying to figure out the interaction between humans and the environment around them. As a natural scientist, my primary role is to figure out how our natural world works. Right? And that's really the foundation of science, is to figure out how our natural world works. And I distinguish the natural from the supernatural, which is a realm in which other ways to figure things out come into play, things like religion and faith. But for the natural world, science and the scientific method has been an incredibly powerful tool to figure out how our world works. And that information has been incredibly important in addressing issues of sort of longevity of our planet and the resources on which we depend. And so my role has been primarily focused on the marine environment. To give you an example of the kinds of things that I work on, most recently I'm interested in the impact of nutrient pollution. By that I mean things like nitrogen. Nitrogen is incredibly abundant in things like sewage and also in fertilizer. And I'm almost embarrassed to say that the work that I've done really hasn't discovered anything new. In fact, the idea that loss of nutrient has a negative impact in our coastal ocean has been well documented probably for the last 30 years. And in fact, what I'm doing is really dotting the I's and crossing the T's. I think what is really important in this context is that while we are looking at very specific corners of the planet, the role of the scientists have changed over the last 30, 40 years. A long time ago, when I was a graduate student, we really didn't consider the broader impacts of our study. We were supposed to do our science and hand off the facts to the important people who make up policies and responses to them. And in fact, we were told to stay away from talking about our science because we would be then undermining our own credibility by being an advocate for a particular stance. That's changed substantially over the last few generations. I'm talking about academic generations, which is about 6 or 7 years in duration. We are now required for many funding agencies to talk about and think about broader impacts of our study. What is the benefit to the society of the things that we want to do? And so that has become an important part of the work that we do. And so we've transitioned from taking a very narrow view of the Earth from a sort of a scientific method approach to a much more holistic view of how our work impacts the broader society. And so in my role as the chair of the Environmental Science Department, I try to impart those views. Not only is it important to be a good scientist, but also engage in the broader discussions about these issues, and whenever possible, provide potential solutions and directions as science best tells or informs a particular issue. So we can be advocates as well as good scientists, as long as we stick to the understanding of what the scientific method affords us in terms of how we understand how our world works.
Great, thank you very much. Very good.
Okay, well, maybe this is a good transition because I'm not a natural scientist. I don't consider myself a scientist at all. I got a graduate degree in a department of politics, not even political science. So I've been trained to sort of how to look at the political world. And so I want to say something in response to Keo, but I guess the way to preface that is that, to me, sustainability has become the category in which we think about environmental challenges. It's been kind of long in the coming. I mean, we could go back and look at when conservation played that role, or preservation played that role, and so forth. But I think certainly, I guess with the Brundtland report, Our Common Future put the concept of sustainability on the map, and it basically said that to be sustainable requires 3 elements. We need to be sort of ecologically sound, we need economic viability, and we need social justice. And if any piece of that is missing, it would be hard to sustain. And the way they defined sustainability was to meet the needs of the present generation without sacrificing the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Strong importance on needs, and a recognition that many people don't have their needs met now, and many of us have many more than our needs. Many of our desires are being met, and it's an unsustainable world to the degree that some of us are living so high on the hog and some of us are living so low on the hog, as it were. And much of the conversation has been, how do you bring those 3 things together? In listening to Kehoe, I think that perhaps where we can distinguish ourselves at being not a natural scientist is that in many ways I think we look at sustainability, some of us look at it, and not Kehoe, but as a biophysical fact, that there's somehow a kind of a sweet spot that we could find between those 3 things. And what's fundamentally underneath of it is the biophysical constraints of the planet, that there are fundamental physics and chemistry that we can do everything we want. We can sort of build houses in floodplains, we could pump tremendous amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, we could sort of put ozone depleting substances into the atmosphere, but at some point in time we're going to come up against biophysical limits, and that's what's going to be our kind of touch point for sustainability. And what I would just add to that, though, is that as a student of politics, that to me the interesting questions is sort of sustainability for whom and how to get sustainability. The international community right now has put a target of 2 degrees Celsius in terms of rising temperatures. And in Paris, in the last climate meetings, they actually reduced that a little bit. They said 1.5, but nothing above 2 degrees. And that kind of sits out there as this kind of apocalyptic signal. And the question is, how close will we come to that? And I actually think that doesn't, I mean, it's helpful in one sense. It's helpful for international negotiations and so forth, but it's not all that helpful for those people who've already suffered tremendous damage. So for the victims of Katrina, 2 degrees is sort of, the apocalypse has come. For those people who live in other parts of the world, I've done some research in India and Nepal, looking at people sort of on the receiving end of climate change, in the sense that people living on the most vulnerable lands with the least amount of resources. And 2 degrees is not, oh, thank you. I'll start over. No, you get my point, I think. And so what I've been really interested in is thinking about sustainability, but sort of both the moral questions and the political questions that are involved with that. And maybe we'll get into this, but my sense is that even we're going to blow through 2 degrees in about 16 years if we just keep doing what we're doing. And despite the important commitments made in Paris, we're going to extend that out a few years, but we're basically going to blow through 2 degrees. And to me, the interesting question is, how are we going to do that together? And are we going to do it in ways that enhance human dignity? Are we going to do it in ways that enhance justice, that make this a democratic way to go down? Or we could go down in a more dog-eat-dog world. There's nothing about dogs. I love dogs. But there's different ways that this can look. And I'm very committed to doing research that tries to figure out what are those factors that are going to tip this in one direction or another. Not because I think that we can sort of tip it and it's all going to be fine. But I do think that within those possibilities that there's some things we could do very well and some things we could really blow.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I was just reflecting on the process that I encountered in the creation of the course I mentioned in the introductory remarks about global sustainability. Undergraduate course, emphatically interdisciplinary in its approach, but I should confess that we faced some pushback from the administration and from non-business units at American University concerning the wisdom and indeed the ethics of situating a course on sustainability in the business school. So sort of against that context, let me provide my perspective on what the business school's contribution to this particular issue is. And what interests me as I see the critical question from the way the corporate sector approaches sustainability is commercialization. I'm sure everybody in this room, and presumably everybody at this university, if we had our druthers, if we could make an instantaneous transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a totally renewable zero-carbon economy, we would do so. But we all know that there are any number of economic and regulatory and political and financial constraints to the quick commercialization of attractive technologies. And I'm astonished at the number of patented technologies that are ring-fenced with intellectual property protections that never see the light of day, which could have potential life-transforming effects. So again, the critical issue that I address in my classes related to sustainability is commercialization. That is identifying and surmounting the barriers to bringing interesting, novel technologies to the market. Now, the critical question from the standpoint of how corporate managers, and we need to assume here, I'm not implying that all corporate managers are sort of vile, vulgar, money-grubbing Gordon Gekko types, but they do have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And mutual funds, venture capitalist, private equity funds also have a responsibility to their investors, and they need to be persuaded with a robust business model to open up their wallets and make investments in unproven technologies, and these represent resources that could be otherwise deployed for other less risky ventures. The critical question that often comes up when we're looking at sustainable technologies, which would subsume renewable energy, environmental management, clean technologies, is scale. An immediate question that comes up when a venture capitalist or an equity investor or a corporation is assessing the market potential of a new technology. Can it be scaled up? Is the addressable market of sufficient size to warrant major investments in this technology? The achievement of scale also enables the generation of economies of scale, which bring the price points of these technologies down to levels that are within reach of a mass market. So we're constantly confronting the issue of scale with respect to how corporations view sustainability. Now let me just raise an example of a project that we did with our MBA students this past fall, partnering up with GE Water and Process Technologies in India, which has an R&D center in Bangalore. And the central question of the project, when we tasked 4 MBA students to do an investigation for GE, was the monetization of an advanced wastewater system at the village level. Actually, it was specifically a membrane bioreactor system, which we thought had potential with respect to village-level deployment in India. And Paula, as you know, anybody who's traveled in India will know that that is a country that has overwhelming problems with respect to water quality, water sanitation, depletion of the aquifer, and so on. And again, GE India reporting to GE US and having to meet certain performance metrics was interested in our team identifying a path to commercialization. And it would not be a plausible business model for us to present where you would have 1 or 2 or a dozen or 50 or 100 or even thousands. For such a business investment to be plausible, you're having to talk about deployments over hundreds of thousands of villages. And so looking forward, we were looking at the GE Village water technology model as a model that could be emulated in other developing and emerging economies. So the central challenge was an attractive technology, again, in a country that has absolutely acute water needs, but how do you build a business case that's going to pass muster with decision makers who are frankly making these decisions about investment resources without a trace of sentimentality. They're making a cold-blooded antiseptic decisions concerning investments of technologies. Now, fortunately, looking at the current trends in sustainable technologies, and I would encourage all of you, if you have not done so already, but the former Vice President Al Gore, who of course has taken a global leadership position on this issue, just a couple of weeks ago delivered a TED Talk that was an absolute tour de force. In fact, it's the single best sort of concise summary of the current state of play in sustainability and climate change that I have seen. Now, obviously, Gore is not a wholly unbiased source on this issue. He has dedicated his post-vice presidency and even back when he was a young congressman to this issue. He is also a senior partner in a London-based socially responsible investing firm called Generation. So he has a financial interest in this. But the data that he presented were pretty compelling, and they have been validated by external resources. If we look at the rate of penetration measured by installed capacity of both solar and wind power, it is rapidly increasing, albeit from a low base. But the technology trend is actually very favorable. The rapid expansion of what we call the intermittent renewables, solar and wind, has been enabled by parallel advances in battery technology. Intermittence, the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. So one of the technological barriers with respect to wind and solar has been advances in battery technology. Now, we have not seen sort of the manifestation of a Moore's law, that is a leapfrogging of the technology curve in battery technology. But in part as the result of major investments by the Obama administration as part of the fiscal stimulus package that was signed back in 2009. A substantial amount of money was flowed through the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and through the national laboratories at Livermore and Oak Ridge and Skindi and so on, doing research, basic research on advanced battery technologies. Now, parallel with this, we see an example of Elon Musk, the wunderkind genius CEO of Tesla, who has opened ground on a huge battery factory, actually in the state of Nevada, which I believe is going to be the biggest battery factory in the world. Now, to the extent that the advances in science and in technology, combined with industrial scale production, will bring the price point down and improve the performance and reliability of batteries, that can open up all sorts of technological possibilities in renewable energy. So,
Quick question, if I may ask a follow-up, and we'll open the floor to questions. But so what happened with the 4 MBA students in their report to GE India?
interesting. Well, the story here is the government of India, the new Prime Minister Modi, who I think has been doing some very interesting things with respect to business-friendly reforms. He's made a number of visits here to the United States, and evidently he gets along swimmingly with President Obama, and the sort of warming of bilateral relations between U.S. and India is part of Obama's strategic pivot to Asia. But one of the things that Modi has done was sign a law that imposes a mandate, a 2% after-tax mandate on all Indian corporations, both domestic and foreign-owned companies, to dedicate 2% of their after-tax profits to CSR, corporate social responsibility type activities. And the conclusion was, yes, there's an obvious need for the installation on a mass scale of modular small-size membrane bioreactors to clean up water at the village level. But subsequent discussions with GE indicated some barriers within the organization. You're talking about a $200 billion organization with respect to actually accessing these CSR funds for this purpose. But then we identified a separate track, and this would be a plan to actually commercialize, monetize wastewater. Wastewater that emanates from the MBR system that may not be potable, that is suitable for drinking, but when cleaned to a certain level would be suitable for agricultural irrigation or cooling of power plants or use in water-intensive industries like textile or papers. So in the follow-up to that project, which we're doing in the fall, is going to be looking specifically at the commercial uses, potential buyers of recycled water, which could then fund a village-level project.
Oh, that's interesting. One thing that David brought up that I was wondering if you would be interested in commenting on, is implied in one of the statements about fiduciary responsibility of corporations. Our system is specifically designed for short-term gain, as we know from Wall Street. Many, many years ago, I did a series for PBS called Made in America, and actually it was a misnomer because it was all about how we lost manufacturing from the 60s to the 80s, where at the time the Japanese and some European models really provided an alternative to that short-term gain by looking at long-term rewards. So the question from, I think, to Paul is, when we are looking at a world that is as competitive and consumptive as it is, especially among first world and those seeking entry, is there any hope for change? David too.
Oh, you want me to take the microphone?
Oh, yeah.
You may not like the answer, though, on the microphone.
It's okay.
Now, it's a great question, Larry, and I think that you put your finger on probably structurally the biggest challenge to focusing on environmental issues, both in terms of the firm and corporations, but also in terms of the nation state. And I think in terms of fiduciary responsibility, I find it interesting. I serve actually on the committee here at AU. It's called the Advisory Committee on Socially Responsible Investing.
It's the President's Committee.
And one of the things students came to us and said we should divest out of fossil fuels, and we studied the issue, looked at AU's endowment, figured out a roadmap toward divestment. We recommended that, and the university came back and said it's not in our fiduciary responsibility to go on that roadmap. I find it interesting that it's not in the university's fiduciary responsibility to do that. It's not in firms' fiduciary responsibility to focus on things other than the bottom line. At some point in time, you wonder, whose responsibility is it then to focus on this? But I wouldn't just put it on firms. The nation state, we have global environmental issues are kind of a unitary problem. They come at the globe as a whole. Climate change doesn't respect national boundaries, and yet the institutions we have that are responding are these fragmented units. And so there's this mismatch at both the commercial and the political level, where a mismatch between the quality of the problem and the kind of character of the response mechanism. And so one of the largest problems in sort of global environmental challenges or global international relations in general is, how do you negotiate that problem? And it's not just spatially and it's not just economic interest. There's also a time compression, in the same way you pointed out that firms, fiduciary responsibility, I have to show quarterly profits very quickly or pretty soon. I'm looking for something else to do. But the same thing with politicians, right? If I'm a congressperson in the United States, I serve for 2 years. As soon as I get elected, I start campaigning to get elected again, and I have to show something within 2 years. So how many people are going to say climate change is my issue? Because in fact, it sort of escapes that time compression. So if you take the time compression issue, you take the space compression issue, do I have hope? I have hope. I have a lot of hope in a lot of things. I have a lot of hope in my initial comments about moral movements and so forth. I have hope in interesting people who are committed to technological innovation. And I think that your comments are right on, that actually you don't actually necessarily need to go at this, you said cold-blooded, sort of antiseptic, I want to make money. There's lots of money to be made out there. But at the same time, there is at some level, there's a discussion about whether the economy sits within the ecology or whether the ecology sits within the economy. And basically, at least neoclassical economics suggests that the ecology is kind of a subset of the economy. And so people are screaming, we can't do anything about climate change because actually GDP will go down. Well, I'll just leave it at that.
But that's an important point for scientists, because we don't think about timescales in the way that most people think about timescales. The shortest sort of timescales in ecology is probably in the order of a century, or 60 years is sort of a timescale for a forest to change from a grassland to a fully mature forest. And if you think about evolutionary science, you're talking about millennia or hundreds of millions of years. And so there's a huge disconnect between the world that we've constructed, the economies and the politics, versus the ecology. And you would have to argue that our world is embedded within the larger ecology of the real world, which operates at a timescale that is so vastly different than the timescales that we are sort of comfortable operating at. And that's part of the problem.
Well, I think compounding that is a perceptual problem. We are not equipped, just as when you study quantum mechanics and you come with string theory or noodle theory or whatever it is that deals with stuff that's subatomic, we're not equipped to imagine it. It's mathematical, and we have to be metaphorical. And I think this is the same problem. I think that the time-space continuum that Einstein got right is something that is almost literally beyond our comprehension. So with that, questions, please.
Can I just elaborate just a bit on this point?
Yes.
The short-term orientation of the traditional American business model, with SEC publicly listed companies that are fastened on quarterly results. And I agree that business model that's so deeply entrenched is a barrier when we're looking at technologies that may take 5, 10, 15 years to materialize. But having said that, we're seeing an increasing number of companies, including public companies like GE, that take seriously what we call the triple bottom line, that is formally incorporating social, economic, and financial metrics in their performance evaluation. But also, in addition to innovations in technology, we're seeing innovations in business models. And I'm thinking in particular the rise of a new class of investors, what we know as social impact investors, socially responsible investors. Al Gore's firm in Generation in the UK would be one of them. There's also a company based in Bethesda called Calvert Investments that has a model that filters out companies, including hydrocarbon companies, that in evaluating these companies with respect to their commitment to sustainable practices. And that company, as well as Gore's company in the UK, claim results that not only match but exceed traditional investment companies. And
It'd be nice if that could be reviewed and tested. One thing that happened, if I may, with the Board of Trustees was that they did agree to do a test fund of $5 million to track it compared to their traditional investment strategies. So I think that the situation in particular at AU is not closed completely, but more data on those kinds of returns on investment I think would be actually really important for our moral future as well as economic.
Yeah, the domain of opportunity is not only to be environmentally correct, but to make money or to achieve acceptable rates of return. I think the universe of things we can do and simultaneously achieve those objectives is expanding. So.
Great. Questions and comments, thoughts? Sir.
Yeah, I have a question for David and for Paul, which is what are some of the ways in which we can begin to hold firms accountable for some of the negative externalities that are associated with the production of energy and goods and services if their processes are dirty and are causing environmental damage, so they're causing environmental costs and healthcare costs for people because they pay taxes and they have revenue streams and all those things, but there's no policy that holds them accountable for the damage they're doing to the surrounding environment.
Paul, you want to go after that?
Sure. It's a great question, and I think that mean, there's different mechanisms of governance out there, and there are economic ones, and there are governmental ones, and so forth. And I would say, on the economic/political side, we know it would work very quickly, at least with climate change, is put a price on carbon. I mean, just if we tax carbon, we could discuss cap and trade versus a tax, but the simple model is tax carbon, and actually the incentives are there for people to go elsewhere. And so I think there are economic mechanisms to do that. How to hold companies accountable to that is a more challenging question. I mean, corporations in this country have the same rights as individuals. They're considered as individuals, and certainly with campaign finance, corporations, well, anybody can give as much money as they want to, basically. And so I think it's very important, I guess, to keep, if we're going to have accountability, it's very important to keep economics, governmental, and sort of cultural life at least somewhat distinct, so they don't all get gobbled up by our economic life. And so when economics sort of runs our politics, and when economics runs our cultural life, then in fact, it's nothing about economics, but it's just that there's a balance in life. I don't just make money in my life. And if just making money in my life decided how I was going to treat my kids and treat my students and so forth,
You wouldn't be a teacher.
I wouldn't be a teacher. I'd get lower valuations probably, but I'd make more money, so it wouldn't matter. But so anyway, that's so. But we have an expert on this, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'd love to hear some thoughts. This is Claire Brunel, who teaches environmental economics here, and I know she's done lots of thinking on holding firms accountable and so forth. So if I could bring you into the conversation, I don't mean to jump off.
No, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
So I teach environmental economics at the School of International Service. And so we look at basically how environmental constraints affect your ability to grow as an economy, and how if you try to protect the environment, how is that going to limit your growth? And so we look at environmental policies, the kind of cap and trade versus tax. You also have to keep in mind that beyond the big kind of policies that we were just talking about, there's also a lot of policies that are not presented as environmental policies because you need a lot of political capital to be able to pass a law that is officially environmental. And so you'll have a lot of energy efficiency policies that will go through that will, that will improve the energy efficiency of buildings or of cars. You have a lot of just energy policies in general, actually, that encourage the use of renewables for companies in general, for states, for counties. But going back to the short-term, long-term discussion that you were having earlier, I think it's important to keep in mind that when you're looking, there's a lot of measures that you can take that actually have gains for you. But the problem is that individuals and companies don't have the kind of long-term frame to allow them to realize that they would actually be beneficial to implement, right? And this is where government policies come in, where they impose these technologies on people, or they give you a subsidy so that you choose the electric car, and so it gives you a short-term gain, even though you don't technically need it if you take into account the whole lifetime utility that you get from a particular technology. But so my point is that there's a lot of environmental policies that are out there. When it comes to pricing carbon, it's a lot more politically difficult. Cap and trade is a lot easier for multiple reasons. One of them would be that it responds to environmental, it responds to the economic situation a lot more. So if you're in a time of recession, a cap and trade doesn't hurt companies, whereas a tax does. So you have to keep those kinds of considerations in mind as well, because every time you want to pass an environmental policy, it's all about, is that going to hurt your companies, or is that going to allow them to still grow?
David?
Thank you.
But can I jump in? So one of the interesting thing about this discussion is, again, it's really about the scale, time scale. And even these solutions are really restricted to maybe 5-10 years. Imagine if we had to think about legislation that would span 100 years and how that would affect the kinds of things that you would have to think about, right? And so if we started thinking about these environmental problems in environmental timescales, the kinds of solutions that we would have to come up with would be fundamentally different than the kinds of solutions that we have on the table now.
I think that's very true. I think, we have so many other kinds of time scale and space scale problems. Our infrastructure, our, long-term planning, budgeting one's economic life is clearly sorely lacking. So I think that long-term point of view, if there's a way, to incentivize, to train, to think about it, would be incredibly valuable. David, you want to?
Yeah, just circling back to your question about holding companies accountable. We do have, at the federal level, the Environmental Protection Agency, and it was a Supreme Court ruling 6-7 years ago that actually authorized the EPA to treat greenhouse gases as something subject to regulation. And the Obama administration has been using it as the tool, turning the screws in the coal industry, for example. But obviously there are going to be a lot of environmental effects, both upstream and downstream externalities that fall outside the purview of the EPA. But beyond the legal regulatory framework, I think there's a lot of sort of naming and blaming and shaming of companies that have a bad record in this area. And you can pretty much guarantee there's going to be some web-based sort of advocacy group that's going to be going after and publicizing companies or individuals in those companies who have a poor record in this area. And I wouldn't minimize the effects of this. I mean, I started teaching the business 10, 12 years ago. The discussion right now is very different than it was a decade ago in terms of its salience. We're seeing many companies in dirty industries, in chemicals and in petrochemicals, that are on their own volition, voluntarily, not with the EPA holding a pistol at their head, but moving towards, I'm talking particularly about resource-intensive companies, paper, pulp, forestry, even microelectronics that use a lot of water and energy and materials, to the extent that they're actually adopting state-of-the-art resource-conserving technologies. Those are results that fall to their bottom line, make their shareholders happy.
So, I think that, again, quickly, just to follow up, if we think about the success that Blackfish, have any of you seen the film Blackfish? Know of it? Its social impact has been phenomenal over the past 3 years, to the point where SeaWorld announced that it was no longer breeding orcas, and that in 2017 they'll stop performances. Now, that's a small entertainment company, but media, social impact, and the web, and social media in general, I believe will have a greater and greater potential for impact on the larger issues before us. Who had a hand up? Yes.
I'm Derry Allen. I've worked at EPA for many years. And I think it's an interesting discussion that started about how can government hold people accountable. And I'd say that government has a very mixed record in that regard, despite the efforts of many of us to try to get government out in front. I think business has, in this country, led the way in many instances. But business doesn't do that all by itself. It does business. Customers want to see this. And customers are also citizens. And yes, that's the basis of a democracy. But when you call them customers, and they start asking for greener products, because they understand what it means to the future of the ecology, and the future of many other aspects of our civilization, then you start getting all kinds of things happening, and specifically on accountability, to see how, in many cases, it's companies that are insisting that their suppliers supply them with goods that are made with relatively sustainable processes and relatively sustainable materials, and you look at, for instance, green buildings, and there are some green buildings here. SIS is really one of the best ones here, but that's the whole movement there was really funded and led by businesses. A new group called the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council is being funded and led by businesses who want to be able to say, let's look at all these labels that are out there for different kinds of so-called green products, and let's tell people which ones are for real and which ones are just sort of shams. So I would say yes, business. You might want to say, how does government hold them accountable? But it's customers, I think, in the end, in their role, not just as citizens in a democracy, but as customers of businesses, that really are driving this. I don't know, Dave, if you want to reflect further on that.
I mean, you're preaching to the choir here. I mean, it's a great pleasure for me. I mean, teaching my courses in CSR and sustainability here at American University, which is one of the greenest campuses in the country. All the sustainability initiatives here, our sustainability program, my colleague Professor Lenos was instrumental in setting that up. And one of the questions that I always ask my undergraduates, and we're talking about the latest green product, and this afternoon we had a discussion of developments in the apparel industry. And the example was H&M, which is actually rolling out a line of products based upon sustainably produced cotton, organic cotton, and so on, along with an apparel recycling program. And kind of our question was, why did it take the year 2016 before somebody thought of this idea? And the question that I asked is, would you mind paying a 25 or 30% premium on fair trade coffee or organic tea or sustainably produced apparel? And usually the answer is yes, we would pay for that. So I think my working hypothesis is this millennial generation of consumers can in fact bring a lot of pressure to bear on corporations that might otherwise be responsive.
We have other examples of that. Patagonia has been doing that for years in terms of organic cotton and traceable down, goose down. Tom's, the shoe manufacturer, has a social responsibility pact with its customers. Do you know of this? Yep. And so I do think it's future generations that have provide some hope.
But I have a question to my colleagues of the choir. I'm a little tone deaf to this argument, and the reason is, so I think that it's absolutely true that customers are asking for greener products and willing to pay a premium, those who can afford it. But if we ask the question, why are businesses in fact responsive to this? It's because they want to make money. And what they want to do is they want to sell more products to people. So what we're doing is we're seeing this very interesting situation where we see sort of conservation and better efficiencies brought to the business model, which is great. And in fact, the reason many companies do this is because they can, on the one hand, save money. So sure, if they conserve energy, their bottom line goes up. And if they're sensitive to reputation, which I think is right on, but part of the sensitivity is because we want to sell products. We want to be seen as a good company that people will be attracted to. But getting back to the question of sustainability on a finite planet, can we, I mean, it's kind of like, car fuel efficiency has gone up, and so CAFE standards have gone up, so people have more cars, actually, and they're driving further. And so, on some level, and it's not to put down that whole effort, because gosh, I mean, frankly, depending on who I talk to, I'm on both sides of this question. But I do think that at some point in time, from a macro level, what we're talking about on some level is sustainable business, not necessarily sustainable planet.
Yep. Good point. Yes, in the back?
Yeah, just to go off of that, I'm just wondering if you guys can speak on the nature of sustainability and capitalism, and how if we look at countries that we like to idolize, like Sweden or these Nordic countries that are very sustainably friendly and have very high living standards, you can see the nature of government and business and how they work together. and government has very high regulations there on the businesses. And so there, in these examples that are some of the most sustainable countries in the world, the businesses are not just being driven by customers, they're actually being very closely tailored and regulated by government. And these regulations actually can inspire a lot of creativity within business. It makes them think of different options or different alternatives that they wouldn't have before. So I was wondering if you guys can speak on the nature of government's role and them taking a bigger role in regulating these businesses, because I don't think they're going to be able to do it on their own just based off customer demands.
David, do you want to?
Well, just for you reflecting on the regulatory environment in Europe, and I was mentioning earlier the rapid increase in the installation of solar and wind power. Well, the world leader in terms of installed capacity is Germany, despite being a cloudy country, and that was due in part to the introduction about 20 years ago of the feed-in tariff structure in Germany that basically locked in a price to incentivize investors in that industry. Now, 20 years hence, Germany is approaching what we would call grid parity in both solar and wind, and then which had spillover effects in terms of the penetration rates of solar and wind in countries like the United States. But a related point is the European Union's mandates, the 20-20-20 mandate concerning greenhouse gas emissions, as well as a mandate concerning green chemistry. And we, unfortunately, at least from my perspective, we don't have such a regulatory framework in the United States, but to the extent that we have American-based companies that have significant operations in Europe, so GE or Dow Chemical or whoever wants to do business in Europe has to comply with the higher European standards. So I can see a sort of regulatory pull effect that would pull the American multinationals in an admittedly more forgiving regulatory environment, but yet being pushed towards the tougher European standards.
And following up, if I may, too, on this issue of, let us say, good government. A friend of my wife and I is Jim Hansen. Speaking of scientists who have become advocates, he in the 1980s, for those who may not recognize his name, was the first scientist to announce, based on his work at NASA Goddard, Columbia University in New York City, that the Earth was warming because of fossil fuels. He is now on a worldwide mission of suing governments for fraud and failure to basically protect the Earth and deal with problems, to address the issues. So that's a pretty powerful choice in his, later life, that he's actually going after governments. I don't think he'll succeed, but any other further comments on good governments? No question?
I have a
Yeah.
suit, so
Yes, but not.
Denmark is
Yeah.
agreed to the suit. And
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Denmark.
And,
Yeah, I thought about that because not all Scandinavian countries are necessarily as strong in this area as one might think. Yes.
I had a question to return to your point about the premiums that consumers are willing to pay, the 30%, which I think is great, and I think it's especially great that millennials are willing to pay those things. But my concern with it is that when those products are being put out, does that, and I don't know if you have, if there's research on this, does that isolate a population of people that won't be able to afford those products and misinform about the differences between the environmentally friendly version and the regular Clorox bleach, for example, and that, as millennials get older and money moves differently, and we have more control over how we're spending our funds, whether we'll still be willing to pay that 30% premium.
Bleach is a good product.
why is Walmart
By the way.
so popular?
Yeah, why is Walmart therefore so popular? It's true.
Walmart
But also one of the
is
largest,
retailer in the world.
but also one of the largest organic retailers. So, thoughts?
Actually, I'm not sure how to answer that question.
It's a problem.
Well,
Go ahead, Bill.
There's actually been a wholesale change in the textile business in the past 2 years since that crash of that factory in Bangladesh. The entire industry has adopted a new standard that, in fact, I've been in touch with an alum who imported 66 million items of clothing to the United States last year. It's across the board, a new standard. They have to hire 200 auditors to go out and check all their factories around the world, and all the retailers are demanding it. So it's only about 10, 15 cents per item to in order to put that new infrastructure in place. The entire industry's changed. The other thing to say here is that it's human beings who work for these companies, and they can't recruit people unless they do something that is attractive to the souls of the people who join them. And very often it's senior management that's had a wake up in the past few years, like Walmart is the main preserver of the largest selling item they sell is bananas. They are the champions of the world in trying to develop sustainable agricultural policies to be sure they can continue that supply. So I think there's a lot of reason to believe that there's a complete mindset change. And one other thing about impact investing, the main tool for financial people has been Bloomberg Finance. It's like the standard thing. It was employees inside of Bloomberg who developed their own ways of measuring things for their own internal use. And everybody, all the employees were enthusiastic about it, and the company made the decision, we're going to make this a product line. And now they sell environmental and social data along with financial data as part of their routines of services to the investment world. So there's a change underway.
But I want to return to what Paul was alluding to, is this idea, it's great to think about shifting towards more sustainable products, but it's still within the framework of business model that operates on a very short time scale. And so we should be stepping back and thinking about not shifting our allegiances to a particular product or a type of product, but shifting back altogether in the amount of consumption that we engage in. Right? The best way to do that is to really turn this into sort of a moral argument, not a business argument. Because moral arguments, I think they tend to have longer time scales in which they operate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at this Deer Park water bottle, and I'm appalled that I'm being filmed with it in front of me. But I'm not going to open it.
Go for it.
So the national
No.
parks are a good model.
Yeah.
Just said that for 100 years ago, no one can touch this.
Well, I hate to belabor this point, but all of you think about what policies would look like if you had to operationalize and implement them over a 100-year period. What would you do? Right? Would it be changing insulation regulations? Probably not. I mean, you'd have to look at wholesale changes in the way we live.
I think there's a question about it.
Do you have a question?
There was a question.
It's really hard though, because I feel so grateful that we are not bound by the decisions of the people who lived 100 years ago. Like, I
Well,
think their
we
decisions
are.
would have been worse than almost
But we are,
every-
though.
Well, we are.
Well, we kind of are, but we're bound by the short-term decisions they made, I guess, and the consequences of those. But if they had said, like, what kind of society do we want to live in? Like, 100 years ago, I mean, our country didn't even have women's suffrage, did it?
No.
Yeah.
But those are different arguments, though.
No, I mean, I think it's true, like, it's bad that we think in such a short-term way. But then there has to be a balance between, like, the capacity of people 20 or 50 years down
But
the road to revise and deviate from the plan.
But in fact, if we had that sort of perspective, long-term perspective, issues of women's suffrage would have, I think, been thought of very differently.
Maybe.
Agreed. You had a question?
I was going to say, I think you put your finger on something really important, which is how do we bring governance to bear at the pace and the speed and the scale that's necessary. And you're right, we wouldn't want to be bound forever by things done in the past, although path dependence suggests that, I mean, getting out of the carbon economy is basically, close to impossible because of all the investments we've made. And we keep making it, so making those turns are difficult. And at the same time, I think what's interesting about this panel is we're talking about different time horizons. And I love what you said, the ecologists will look, I even think 100 years is a short time.
pretty short,
We're talking about 7 generations or something like that, or even beyond that. But I think that human beings, I mean, I don't make decisions about next week yet. And so there's sort of, I mean, we all wrestle with that problem. And I think it's a problem we wrestle with. And so for me, actually, it gets back to the question of capitalism as well. I hope you see the connection here. I don't see capitalism going away. Naomi Klein thinks that'd be the answer, and she's probably right. But it's not going away in my lifetime, and I don't know about anybody here. But what can happen that cuts across time frames and cuts across sort of spatial boundaries is certain guiding principles that we would want to subscribe to. And those can become kind of rudders. And to be sure, culturally, those rudders change over time. And I think the condition of women is a perfect example of that change. But I think this moral dimension you're talking about, we can, individually and in collectivities, commit ourselves to, I'll bring it back to the topic of conversation, to sustainability, to bringing about sort of ecological well-being, economic viability, and social justice. The problem is that each of us grab onto one piece of that, and so a caricature of business folks is that they sort of say, well, let's make sure this makes money, but then the question is, how much money? I mean, that's like an infinite, and how much social justice? That's infinite, and so forth. So I think that it's not impossible to navigate our way through this, but I think it'd be false to think we could find that place, that perfect time horizon, or that perfect spatial boundary that makes sense for us to kind of rest in, because as soon as we rest in it, we're going to find the world leaks out.
Thank you. A question, did you have a question in the back? So let's start here, and then the back, and please.
I think what you had said is, it's true with our society more than other societies, is that more is better. You've got more cars on the road, you've got that are being driven longer distances, you've got more, the person with the biggest house or the most clothes or the best wardrobe is better in the eyes of society as someone who has less. People want a larger house than a smaller apartment and things like that. But I also think that the consumer has a huge effect on business, like what you were talking about with the social media, but I think that they're not educated in a lot of the sustainability efforts that are going on in, say, in Europe with the green chemicals. Because if they were, they would demand that those practices that are going through, the American companies that are operating in Europe under the more strict standards would bring those practices home and exercise those practices here. If it's working over there, why can't it work here? And I think that society kind of needs to change the more is better, but it also needs to be more educated about what's going on in other areas.
I don't disagree.
My question was, we were sort of touching a lot on the points of thinking about the ecological timescale of about 100 years or even farther, and trying to fit down things that might help that within quarterly reports and 2-year election cycles. So my question is, in any of your opinion, what is the best course of action? What do you feel is the best kind of pathway towards finding something that is notably sustainable, that works well into creating something more sustainable that fits within something that's kind of a much shorter time frame than what we think of as sustainability?
I'm not optimistic that we can start thinking about our planet in terms of millennial timescales, but we should definitely push it out from a quarterly perspective to maybe decadal perspective. And I think that's feasible. Maybe? No?
I think so.
Yeah, well, I'll take another one.
Just around 5:15.
5:15.
To enjoy the food before we get.
But we don't want to consume any. No one's hungry. Okay, we have a few more questions. Yes, Lawrence.
So I'd love to hear you all talk a little bit more about the tension that was brought up earlier between nation states and a global problem, right? So how And rather than just throwing up our hands, I mean, we're stuck mainly with the nation state as our governing mechanism. What are ways in which what are the ways in which nation states are able to move things forward? And one example that I had heard about was sort of the notion of even a smaller unit that has economic power, like the state of California, setting certain standards that then have much greater impact across not just California, but across the whole globe, quite likely on the emissions question. And I wondered if you all had other thoughts similarly as to how we can get around the issue of nation states bargaining with each other. And also the issue of sort of the divide between the developed world, who has already exploited the environment, and now we are all living high, and the developing world, which is wanting to live further up. And I think those wants are true and real. I come from that part of the world and have seen it firsthand, that these are real desires that people have, that it's easy to say, don't consume as much, but it's not, we're not necessarily talking about just consuming luxury items, we're talking about basic needs in some cases, in many cases. So how do we, wrestle with some of those tensions?
Personally, I think eventually a solution may be found along educational lines, but through social media. I think with the democratization of communication through smartphones, through social media, I have some hope that future generations will be able to communicate across borders. But what you also asked reminded me of a film that I worked on in 2009 for a PBS series called Now on PBS. We went to Bangladesh to do a film called Bangladesh Water World, but it was really about establishing the fact that there are climate change sufferers, climate change refugees. And I recall one gentleman who basically said in several years or decades that there will be a mass migration from the Indian subcontinent, basically, a diaspora to Europe, much as we actually see today with Syria happening. And he said very specifically, it was haunting, he said, you will have to decide how you will treat 3 million people knocking at your borders. Will you open your borders, or will you use machine guns to keep them out? And I think that's the fundamental nation state versus individual actors, if you will. But other comments?
Well, I just wonder if we should just maybe hear from a few other people, and then we can make final comments, because we're going to run out of time. So why don't we just hear?
Anybody not asking a question? Yes, in the back, and then.
We can just hear everybody, and then
yeah,
better to hear them than us.
Thank you. I get the different comments that you have had about sustainability and about the relationship of business and about like the morals and everything. But for instance, if I go to some African countries, people generally don't have the same notion about sustainability. For instance, here it might be I want maybe buy something in plastic, or I don't know, something that maybe I'm not going to buy a bigger car or something like that. But generally people think more about, if I had more money, then I should allow myself to have whatever I want. And it can be something, a small car, a big car, or something, depending on how much money he has to buy the food. So the conception of sustainability has like some cultural differences that sometimes really can impact the decision and the final goals and the results that can be drawn from it. So what do you think about like the cultural implication like in the debate?
Again, I think we'll listen to folks and wrap up, but I think it's a really important point. There was another question or comment? Yes?
So I'm also in the Global Sustainability course with Professor Stark, and we talked a lot about stealth sustainability, and I just wanted to know your opinions on how would companies or businesses kind of show other companies who might be less sustainable how to become sustainable without being more of a hindrance on them and stepping on their values as a company, and how do they bring them up?
New question? Okay, one more question and then we'll wrap up. Question or
I have
comment?
a final question for Professor Kim. It's more science-based. But I've been learning a lot about the effects of methane on the atmosphere, and I know a lot of people at my school as well have similar questions. And so I've basically been learning just that methane is a much more potent gas than carbon dioxide when it's originally released. And a lot of it comes from our urban, or from agriculture, livestock agriculture. So I'm wondering if we cut back on methane and that has a quicker reaction in terms of our abilities to stay within that -2 degrees. So if we cut back on methane, it'll be a quicker reaction in terms of how our atmosphere reacts. Why do you think methane is not spoken about at all, or in regards to carbon dioxide?
It's a argument based on amount that's in the atmosphere. So methane is a much more potent gas, but the abundance of methane relative to carbon dioxide is just doesn't compare. So that's why the focus on CO2. So I mean, we may have to worry about it when the tundra begins to thaw and the methane is released in large volumes, but from sort of the urban agricultural kinds of things, it's currently not a huge issue.
That's kind of a myth that it's affecting the climate change tremendously.
In the past, it has, right, Karen?
I think it could. I think, like, I kind of agree with Kiva. I feel like I would like to look it up to answer your question more accurately, but I think each molecule of methane is much more powerful than each molecule of CO2, but the amount, it's like thousands of times more CO2 is in the atmosphere, and moreover, we are adding much larger quantities of it. So even if you got rid of all the methane from livestock, I don't think it would really solve the problem. Although it would be a piece, but it's not a real big piece.
I've just read some of these
Sakina?
things.
But I don't know. I think it's also not that well understood, because there's a lot of methane that leaks out of natural gas distribution systems and fracking that is completely unaccounted for. So
Or from the Gulf of Mexico?
yeah.
So I can't speak to the science of it, but from the political side, methane is a covered gas. So when in global climate politics, the way we deal with methane is by converting methane emissions to
Carbon CO2.
to a CO2 E, we would call it, CO2 equivalents. So we do address it, but your point is well taken, that why are we not paying more attention to it?
Yeah, I've just read different studies that say that they're having a really tremendous effect.
I think we're going to finish up.
Alright, so I'm just curious.
Final thoughts in a minute.
1 minute.
Paul.
Okay, the north-south question, fabulous question, and I'm struck by, Thomas Friedman points out that at least with climate change, it's as if the developed countries basically sat down and had dinner. They had hors d'oeuvres, main course, soup, whatever, and they invite the developing countries to coffee and they say split the bill, and in fact that's what we're doing. And the ecological space, even in Paris, the ecological space was never thought about in terms of ethical responsibilities. In terms of the question of more, I think it's a really great point. And what's so striking is that, yes, we're in a society of more consumptive society, and we're not all that happier. And I mean, they say that sort of Fortune 500 folks have the same happiness level as the Amish. So in fact, it really does call for us to rethink that. The question
How do they define happiness?
There's happiness studies.
Oh, I know, I've read it. Yep.
Apparently I'm not happy. But two other quick points. On the consumptive side, I mean, I understand that consumers can be drivers of this. And, I want someone to stop me from my criminal behavior. I mean, yes, I want to, but there's Exxon, which made more money than any corporation, any entity that has ever made money on the planet. People have tried to get into those stockholder meetings. They've tried to suggest there's another discourse out there. I think it's important, but I don't think it's the main. Well, I'll just leave it at that. And the final question about the nation state, I think it's a great question, and it's the one of the $12 billion questions, a lot of billion-dollar questions. But I think one way that I think about it is if the nation state is the main operating system out there, we should think though about, and not destroying it, right? If we got rid of it, we'd have to invent it tomorrow because the EPA does great things and the State Department and so forth. But there's political space both above and below the state. And so international institutions, the negotiations you're talking about, incredibly important, partially because they capture the state. They hold the state accountable to something larger than itself, but also underneath the state, the importance of civil society, which is also a type of capturing the state where when norms change, marriage equality is kind of a perfect example of where things have shifted underneath, and I got to stop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So somebody that I know once said, television was a great democratizer. He grew up in a very small town and ended up being a full professor at Cornell University, and he attributed that success to television because he saw the world around him that he would have never seen from where he was growing up. And to that point, I think the access to information that we have today, which is incredible, I think will also lead to those kinds of revelations where people see that having all the accesses that we have doesn't necessarily lead to happier lives. And so that's what I'm hopeful about.
So 2 quick comments. First on the specific question about the transmission of best practices. I think to the extent that in Professor Stark's course and in the sustainability, Master Sustainability Program, that we're actually developing rigorous methodologies for sustainability metrics. And it's much easier to make the case for a cash constrained company to make investments if there are actual numbers to them in terms of the financial impact. The second broader comment is going to the issue that you raised concerning developed world, developing world. And I'm deeply interested in the question of technology innovation in emerging markets. And I think that they're very well positioned to undertake a sort of technology leapfrogging. And the example of India that I discussed earlier, where you've got these highly energy intensive membrane bioreactors and reverse osmosis desalination in a country that has severe energy shortages and where much of the country is off grid. And so a lot of very interesting thinking as well as technology development is at the water energy nexus that is using distributed generation to enable the installation of advanced water systems at the village level in India. But kind of a second example, I just got back from the United Arab Emirates. A very harsh environment, and there's some amazing developments in concentrated solar, for example. So to the extent that the emerging markets, given the concentration, in the case of UAE, of money and talent and technology, accelerating the development of these technologies for venture deployment in the developed markets.
My last comment would be that if we are concerned with consumption, we will be consuming some food courtesy of the library momentarily. If we remember that consumption has several meanings, one of which used to be the definition of a terrible, horrible disease that eats from within, called tuberculosis. So I would leave you on that note. And thank you very, very much for a lively discussion.